Arlen Voss woke up to the cold of metal against his cheek. The floor was shaking. Something was tapping rhythmically against the wall. He opened his eyes and saw rows of dark iron chairs, and people who were waking up just as he was. Someone was screaming. Someone was shaking their neighbor by the shoulders. A woman in a business suit was pounding on the window, but beyond the glass was only a gray haze with no top or bottom. Arlen sat up and counted the people. 62 people. The car was long. The two doors at the ends were sealed with corrugated metal plates. A panel of frosted glass hung over the central aisle. Arlen took it all in before he had time to feel afraid. It was a habit he'd carried over from his past life. First, count, then feel. In his past life, he'd kept inventory records at a logistics company, and no one ever noticed him. Skinny, glasses, a quiet voice. People like him always stand at the back of the line. The panel above the aisle flashed. A steady voice, devoid of gender or age, filled the car. The voice introduced itself as the registry. The registry announced that the train was traveling through the worlds and that every car was required to pay the fare. Car number 17 must surrender 20 units of value by the end of the day. In the event of non-payment, the car would be cleared out along with its contents. With a click, a compartment with a black tray opened beneath the panel. The registry added that it alone determined the value of the items and fell silent. There was a moment of silence. Then, the car erupted. People were shouting at one another. Someone demanded that they break down the doors. A burly man in a leather jacket with a shaved head leaped onto a chair and bellowed that order was needed here and that he would be the one to enforce it. His name was Barrett. This became clear quickly because he repeated his name as relentlessly as a hammer drives a nail. Two burly guys stood beside him. The crowd obediently fell silent. People always follow the loudest voice when they're afraid. A gray-haired old man in a worn coat slipped a gold ring off his finger and walked over to the counter. He said that gold was more valuable than anything else and that he would be the first to buy his way out of this. And then Arlen spoke up. He didn't stand up. He simply said into the silence that there was no need to put the ring down. Everyone turned around. The old man asked who he was to be giving orders. Arlen calmly replied that the registry had defined units of value, not units of weight, and not gold. He said that the system had declared itself the appraiser. That meant the price wouldn't be the market price, but the system's own. He said that in a closed system, what's valuable is what's rare and necessary, not what sparkles. Water, food, medicine, tools. He suggested testing the scanner first with a cheap item to see what number it displayed. Barrett snorted and asked since when the four eyes had been giving orders, but the old man had already pulled a cheap scarf from around his neck and placed it in the tray. The panel showed 0.1. The old man held a ring over the tray. Arlen said calmly that it would now read 0.3. The panel showed 0.3. A collective sigh rippled through the car. The old man looked at Arlen as if seeing him for the first time. Barrett frowned. He didn't like it when people weren't looking at him. He jumped out of his seat and announced that from that moment on, all food and water were to be turned over to the common fund under his protection. His men went down the aisles and emptied people's bags. They took Arlen's jacket and half a chocolate bar. He didn't resist. He just watched and counted. Barrett had 2 fighters and 8 units of collected food. They were catastrophically short of 20. Arlen returned to his seat. Seat number 33, third row from the rear door, by the window. And at that moment, the armrest beneath his palm grew warm. Arlen froze. The warmth radiated from inside the metal as if from a living thing. Something clicked softly under the seat. He lowered his hand and felt a recess that had opened up, one that hadn't been there before. Inside the recess stood a plastic bottle of water, sealed, cold, half a liter. Arlen slowly looked around. No one was watching. Everyone was watching Barrett as he divided the car into sections. Arlen pulled out the bottle and slipped it under his shirt, beneath his belt. Then he reached into the recess again. It was empty. He ran his fingers along the edges. The metal was smooth and warm. A minute later, the warmth faded and the recess closed up so that there was no seam left. Arlen sat motionless, thinking. There were 80 seats in the car. People were already shifting and switching seats, so either all the seats were like that or just his. He gently touched the armrest of the empty seat next to him. Cold, lifeless metal. No click. He returned his hand to his own seat, and the metal responded with a barely perceptible warmth, like a dog recognizing its master. Arlen closed his eyes and forced his breathing to steady. Rule number 1. No one must know. In a car where there's food for one day, but you have to pay every day, a person with an endless supply will become either king or fodder. More likely fodder. He kept track of time by the clatter of the wheels and by counting in his head. About an hour later, the armrest warmed up again. A click. In the recess lay a can of stewed meat with no label. Arlen covered it with his foot and waited for the right moment. Barrett was just yelling at someone at the other end of the car. Arlen stood up and, as if stretching his back, walked over to the registry's tray. He placed the can down. The panel displayed 1 whole and 2/10 units. A murmur swept through the car. Barrett spun around and asked where the can had come from. Arlen replied that he'd found it under a seat at the back of the car. He said this in the dull voice of a tired man. Barrett narrowed his eyes, but there really was trash and other people's bags lying under the seats. He ordered his men to search the back of the car. They turned everything upside down and found nothing but someone's umbrella. Barrett took note of Arlen. Arlen could tell by the look in his eyes. He returned to seat 33 and waited for the next hour to pass. Meanwhile, the car was in a frenzy. A young woman with a medical bag was bandaging a man who'd been hit in the head during the fight. Her name was Mira. She was the only one doing anything useful and didn't ask Barrett for permission. An old man with a ring sat across the aisle from Arlen and glanced at him from time to time from under his gray eyebrows. His name was Holt. He said aloud, without addressing anyone in particular, that only the appraiser knew the numbers, and that either the guy was a genius or he knew something. Arlen pretended to doze off. An hour passed. The armrest grew warm. Arlen covered the hollow with the jacket he'd managed to snatch back from the general pile and fished out the object by feel. His fingers recognized the handle before his eyes did. A folding knife with a heavy blade. Not a kitchen knife, a work knife. Arlen felt his heart skip a beat twice with a single rumble of the wheels. Water, food, now a weapon. The seat yielded random items, but those random finds ranged from useful to vitally important. He bent down as if tying his shoe and tucked the knife into the toe of his sock under his pant leg. When he straightened up, he met the gaze of a pair of eyes 3 rows away. A boy of about 14, with a sharp and a gaze far too mature for his age, was staring straight at him. He was looking at his hand, then at the armrest, then back at his hand. The boy had seen it. Arlen exhaled slowly and didn't look away. Neither did the boy. Somewhere above them, the registry dispassionately updated the display. 16 hours remained until the deadline. 9 6/10 units out of 20 had been collected. The boy didn't scream or run over to Barrett. He simply stood up and moved 1 row closer. He sat diagonally and stared out the window at the gray haze. Then he whispered against the glass that silence was worth a meal. Arlen appreciated the gesture. No threats, no tantrums. A straight deal. Just as quietly, he asked through his own window what the boy's name was. The boy replied that his name was Theo and that he'd been living at the train station for 2 years. So he knew what a person who was hiding something valuable looked like. Arlen said he'd pay with food and that the first payment would be that evening. He also said that if Theo sold him out to Barrett, the food would run out and Barrett would take everything and get rid of the witness first. Theo nodded at the window. That's how Arlen got his first contact. Not a friend, just a pair of eyes looking in the right direction, for now. The next hour yielded a coil of sturdy cord. Another hour later, the compartment yielded a pack of batteries with no flashlight to go with them. A coincidence remained a coincidence. Arlen hid everything in the torn upholstery under the seat and kept count. By evening, according to his internal tally, the car had collected 12 items. Barrett had squeezed everything out of the people. Watches, belts, cell phones that the registry had valued at a paltry fraction of their worth. Panic was rising like water in a hold. Holt said aloud that at this rate there would be 15 by the deadline and that he was too old to die because of arithmetic. Barrett barked that the old man could hand his teeth in to the scrap bin. His guys burst out laughing. Arlen silently decided that the time had come. He could no longer slip items out one by one on his own. It was too conspicuous. He whispered the plan to Theo. Theo knew how to move so that eyes slid right off him like water off grease. 10 minutes later, the boy found a can of peaches buried under the trash in the middle row. Another half hour later, a bottle of water was discovered in the gap between the panels. Then, a packet of crackers behind the heating pipe. Theo dragged each find loudly over to the collection bin, and the number on the scoreboard kept rising. The car came alive with every click of the score. People began crawling under the seats and prying open the panels themselves. Sometimes they even actually found something among the old trash. It was the perfect cover. Barrett stood by the tray, frowning more and more. He didn't believe in the car's benevolent spirits. He believed in hidden stashes and in that quiet, bespectacled guy who was guessing the numbers. By nightfall, the tally was 2 whole and 3/10 units short. A seat yielded a can of coffee. Score, 1.5 units. 8/10 remained. And then something happened that Arlen hadn't planned. Holt took the chain with the medallion off his neck and stood over the tray for a long time. Then he put it down. down. The panel showed exactly 8/10. The display flashed green. The registry announced that contribution from car 17 had been accepted and that the train would arrive in the intermediate world in 30 minutes. The car erupted in a cry of relief. People hugged one another. Holt returned to his seat with an empty neck and gave Arlen a long look. He said quietly that he'd worn the medallion for 40 years and that he'd given it up without hesitation because all day long, someone invisible had been pulling the car toward life. He said he'd never trusted quiet people like Arlen his whole life. And now he looked at him and couldn't understand how the bespectacled man had guessed the price of the ring down to the 10th of a unit. Arlen replied that he was simply good at math. Holt smiled with half his mouth and said that math didn't explain the peaches. He didn't have time to finish. The train jolted. The clatter of the wheels changed rhythm, and the mist outside the windows parted. The car rolled out beneath a low, crimson sky. Beyond the glass stretched a plain of gray ash dotted with black, skeletal trees. Something was moving among the trees. Quite a lot of it. The registry came to life and announced that the stop would last 3 hours. Each car is authorized to gather resources from outside. Any loot obtained will be credited toward future contributions. The doors are unlocked. The registry bears no responsibility for the lives of passengers outside the car. The rear door slid open with a hiss, and the smell of ash and something sweetly rotten rushed into the car. People recoiled from the opening. Barrett quickly realized that loot meant power for tomorrow. He also realized that he wasn't the one who should die, for they'd wasn't his to bear. He announced that those who had contributed the least would be sent outside. He pointed at 5 people: a skinny college student, a middle-aged man with a limp, 2 women who had only handed over their clothes, and Arlen. Barrett smiled and said that since the bespectacled guy was so smart, he wouldn't be worth a thing out there. Mira snapped and said it was murder. Barrett replied that it was economics. Arlen stood up silently. Arguing was pointless, and it was even better not to argue. Barrett's eyes weren't out there. Outside, there were only trophies and his own supplies. Before leaving, he crouched down to tie his boot and pulled from his hiding place a knife, a cord, and the last item the chair had given him just before it stopped. A thick signal flare cylinder with an inscription in an unfamiliar language. The 5 of them stepped out onto the ashes. The limping man was shivering so hard his teeth were chattering. Arlen briefly told everyone to follow him and not to run without a command. The student asked who had appointed him the leader. Arlen replied that those who had stayed inside had appointed him, and he led the way. The ash springed under their feet. 30 paces from the mound, amber-colored growths jutted out, and the registry in his ear dispassionately noted that the resinous knots were valued at 1 unit each. People rushed to break off the growths. Arlen wasn't looking at the resin. He was looking at the furrows in the ash. Wide, fresh, with drag marks. He said they had about 10 minutes, and that greed was the currency of death here. No one answered him. The women were stuffing their bags. And then a crawler rose from beneath the black tree. The creature was the size of a bull, a flat head with no eyes. 6 legs and a mouth stretching across its entire body. It moved toward the women as silently as his shadow. Arlen didn't run toward the car. He ran straight at it. His mind worked as coldly as a calculating machine, a creature with no eyes, so it relies on hearing or heat. As he ran, he lit a torch and hurled it to the right onto a pile of dry branches. The torch hissed and burst into white flame. The crawler instantly turned toward the noise and heat. Arlen approached from the side. A blue vein pulsed beneath the skin fold beneath its left front paw. He drove the knife in up to the hilt and yanked downward. The creature screeched so loudly that ash rained down from the trees. Its tail lashed out, flinging Arlen to the ground. His ribs howled. He rolled away. The crawler thrashed around the torch, growing weaker with every heartbeat as smoking blood spurted from its wound. Then it collapsed and went still. Silence. 5 people stared at Arlen and didn't move. Arlen got to his feet, clutching his side, and slid open the bony crest on the creature's nape with his knife. Inside lay an egg-shaped core the color of deep water. The log noted that the crawler's core was accepted at a rate of 5 units. The return trip was quick. Arlen brought up the rear and carried the core under his arm. At the very edge of the embankment, he turned around. Far off among the trees stood 3 more silhouettes, and they weren't approaching. They were simply watching him go, the way wolves watch a foreign pack. In the car, they were met by a wall of faces. The women dumped out the resin. 11 units. Then Arlen placed the core in the tray, and the display showed +5. The total count for the upcoming contribution stood at 16 units even before the stop was over. The car hummed. Holt stood in the front row, and his expression changed before their eyes. 40 years of skepticism peeled away from him like old paint. He said loudly that the quiet, bespectacled guy had taken down a beast that would have terrified a whole platoon. The student rambled excitedly about the torch and the blow to the paw. Mira approached silently and pulled Arlen's shirt up at the side. A bruise spread from his armpit to his waist. She said 2 ribs were cracked and that the hero deserved some rest. Barrett stood at a distance and didn't clap. He looked at the knife in Arlen's hand, then at his calm face. Then he called over his senior fighter, Drex, and whispered something to him. Drex nodded and looked at seat 33. Theo slipped past Arlen and, barely moving his lips, whispered that he'd heard the order. At dawn, Drex and the guys would search every seat in the rear, every single one by one, starting with seat 33. Arlen hadn't slept all night. His ribs burned with every breath, but his mind was clear. The search at dawn posed 2 threats. The first was a hiding place in the upholstery. The second was the armrest itself, which could snap open at any moment right under Drex's hands. They dealt with the first threat in an hour. Theo moved the supplies one by one into the ventilation duct above the rear door while the car was asleep. The boy moved between the rows like a breeze. Arlen experimented with the second threat. He removed his hand from the armrest and sat like that for the entire hour. The compartment didn't open. The warmth came and went without a click, so the chair only released objects when his hand was right there. It was waiting for its owner. That thought stung even more than his ribs. Not a trap of chance, but a choice. The chair had chosen him. Just before dawn, he placed his palm on the metal, and the recess released what it had stored. A flat black stick with 2 steel prongs at the end. The stick hummed when he pressed the button, and a white arc crackled between the prongs. A stun baton. Arlen hid it in his sleeve and prepared to wait. Drex began with great fanfare. He announced to the entire car that order required transparency and that honest people had nothing to fear. Seat 33 was the first to be ripped open. Drex personally stuck his fingers into the torn upholstery and pulled out nothing but a clump of gray cotton. He tapped the armrests. The metal responded with a steady, dead sound. The seat was as silent as a safe. Drex moved on, and with every empty seat, his face grew more and more angry. He wasn't searching in general. He was searching for something specific to one person, and that person turned out to be clean. By the 20th seat, his patience ran out. Under Holt's seat, he found a can of sardines that the old man had honestly found yesterday in the general trash and hadn't had time to turn in. Drex raised the can above his head as if it were the evidence of the century. He declared, "Here he is, the thief who's eating his way through the car." He struck the old man with an open palm and Holt fell between the rows. The car fell silent. Barrett, from the back row, lazily remarked that harboring a criminal was punishable by double ration confiscation. Drex swung his leg back, but he didn't strike because Arlen was already standing between him and the old man. He didn't remember how he'd stood up or how he'd walked through 3 rows. His body had decided on its own. Drex bared his teeth and said that the 4 Eyes had put himself in just the right spots. The car shifted backward, clearing the aisle. Mira shouted that Arlen had broken ribs. Drex replied that the rest would be broken soon. He was a head taller and 30 kilos heavier. He fought for money, and it showed in his stance. Arlen stood straight and stiff, as if waiting in line. He said he'd give Drex one chance to back off. The car gasped. Drex laughed and struck. He struck quickly and precisely. A straight punch to the head with a step in. Arlen shifted a hand's breadth to the side, and an arc of white fire met the fist halfway. A crack, the smell of something burning. Drex was thrown backward and slammed into the seats. He leaped up in sheer fury, and Arlen met him with a jab to the neck above the collar. The second crack was louder. Drex fell face first into the aisle and lay there, twitching his leg. 3 seconds. The whole fight lasted 3 seconds. The car was so quiet you could hear the cooling baton humming. Arlen turned to Barrett. He said in an even voice that the guards would no longer beat people. That food would be distributed according to a tally, and Holt would keep the tally in front of witnesses. That Barrett could remain the head of housekeeping if he wanted to be useful. Barrett looked down at his best fighter lying on the floor, then at the second fighter, who was examining his boots very intently, then at the faces of the passengers. The balance of power had shifted in 3 seconds, and Barrett was just as good at math as Arlen. He managed to say that order and accounting were exactly what he'd always advocated. The car let out a collective sigh of relief. By noon, everything had sorted itself out. Mira was given a separate row to serve as an infirmary. Holt took charge of the head count and turned out to be as meticulous as a tax inspector. The burly Ortega, who had been silent by the window the whole way, approached Arlen on his own and said that he used to work as a construction worker and that if anything needed to be built or torn down, he was there to help. Theo officially became their eyes and ears, so Arlen now had not just a pair of eyes, but a whole team. That evening, the registry came to life without a schedule. A voice announced a new feature. From now on, a car ranking system would be in effect. Each car's contributions, production, and losses would be visible to everyone else. Cars had the right to form alliances and to absorb one another. The panel displayed a table. 415 cars. Car 17 was ranked 200th. Arlen read the table and felt a chill beneath his breastbone. Someone up there was changing the rules of the game, from survival to war. There were rows in the table crossed out in gray. Holt asked what the gray color meant. The registry replied dispassionately that gray marked cleared and abandoned cars. Their property and seats would go to the first person to claim them. Arlen and Holt exchanged glances. Abandoned cars meant seats. Unclaimed seats. Arlen didn't yet know if his seat was the only one in the entire train, or if every car had its own heart. But it wasn't worth risking his life to find out. They didn't give him a chance to finish his thought. Someone struck the front door of the car from the outside. Then again. Rhythmically, with expertise. A muffled voice came through the corrugated metal. The voice announced that car 16 was greeting its neighbors. That the neighbors, according to the schedule, had made a decent haul, and that starting today, car 17 would pay car 16 10 units a day for a peaceful night's sleep. Something to think about until the next stop. Then the doors would open to the worlds, and the doors between the cars would no longer be opened by the registry. The knocking stopped. Barrett turned pale and said that there were some athletes riding in car 16 and that there were at least 80 of them. All eyes turned to Arlen. He stared at the door and said nothing. Then he said that only those who have nothing with which to fight back pay tribute, and that there was a great deal to accomplish before the stop. No one knew how much time they had until the stop, so Arlen assumed the worst. He gathered the team at the infirmary and laid out the plan in detail, just as he had once analyzed warehouse invoices. Ortega was assigned defense. He removed 4 chairs from their mountings and built a barricade out of them 3 meters from the front door, leaving a narrow passageway by the window. The logic was simple. 80 people mean nothing if only 2 are at the point of engagement. Holt was assigned the rear. Water, food, and bandages had to be kept behind their backs, not lying underfoot. Mira prepared the infirmary and boiled what water was left. Tio was given the most important task. The boy found a ventilation grate in the vestibule running along the length of the train and confirmed that one could crawl along the duct above the door toward car number 16. Arlen forbade him from going too far. Just listen. Chair 33 was working for the war effort. An hour yielded a hammer. Another hour yielded a spool of wire. Then a can of construction foam, which Ortega poured into the door grooves so the panel couldn't be pried open quickly and quietly. Then the chair produced something that made Ortega's eyes light up. A 1-meter-long black steel mounting bracket. By the end of the day, car 17 had ceased to be a queue for death and began to resemble a fort. People worked in silence and with a grim determination. Even Barrett's men were hauling chairs. Shared fear turned out to be the best foreman. Tio returned from the storage compartment by nightfall. Through the bars, he could hear how, in car 16, they were sharpening rebar against the edges of the shelves, and how their leader, named Kano, was assigning tasks. Kano said they had to strike as soon as the registry unlocked the intercar doors at the stop, that they had to take the food from the women and that smart aleck who, according to rumors, had taken down the beast. A separate reward was promised for the smart aleck because the train conductor had asked about him. Arlen asked him to repeat that last sentence twice. Theo repeated it word for word. The train conductor had been asked about him. The boy hadn't heard who or why. Arlen pushed that thought to the back of his mind and returned to his defensive duties. He had to wait less than a day. The train jolted. The rhythm of the wheels slowed, and the mist outside the windows parted over a world of rusty dunes beneath 2 dim suns. The conductor announced a 2-hour stop and the unlocking of all doors. The panel of the inner car passage hissed and slid aside. Foam in the grooves burst with a crack, and the door remained 1/3 of the way open. Hands clutching metal bars immediately reached through the gap. It had begun. The first attacker squeezed through sideways and took a blow to the collarbone from Ortega's pry bar. Arlen met the second one with a sweeping blow from his baton. The third fell on top of the first 2. The narrow passageway was working like a hand-cranked meat grinder. But Kano was no fool. Shadows ran along the embankment outside, past the windows. They were carrying crowbars and aiming at the windows in the rear section where there was no barricade. Arlen yelled at Ortega to the door and dashed toward the rear. The glass shattered, and two of them leaped inside. A third was climbing in after them. Arlen met the first one with a chair, which he shoved down the passageway like a battering ram. The second one swung a rebar bar, and Mira smashed a peach can against the back of his head with all her might. Arlen hit the third one in the window with a baton to the jaw, and he tumbled back onto the dune. In the front, Ortega was roaring. The door was forced open halfway, and three of them were already fighting five in the aisle. To everyone's surprise, Barrett was fighting in the front row. He was swinging a construction hammer and yelling that this was his car. At that moment, a bottle with a burning rag flew over their heads. Someone in car 16 had come up with the idea of using fire. The bottle struck the barricade, and the flame splashed onto the seats and onto Barrett's shoulder. He smothered the fire with his jacket and kept striking. Arlen realized that the odds were not in their favor. 80 against 60, it was a battle of attrition. They had to break the will, not kill the people. He shouted for Theo to bring the bag from the infirmary. Inside the bag lay the last-minute item he'd been saving, a thick cardboard firework tube marked with unfamiliar letters. Arlen lit the fuse from a smoldering chair and hurled the tube through the door crack into the depths of car 16. 3 seconds of silence. Then, the enemy car exploded in a blaze of light and a deafening roar. Balls of red and white fire struck the ceiling and ricocheted through the rows. In that enclosed iron box, it sounded like the end of the world. The attack faltered instantly. Kano's men surged back into their own smoke. Arlen ordered them forward. Ortega pried out the jammed panel, and Carriage 17 launched a counterattack through the aisle. There was almost no resistance. The attackers, blinded and deafened, huddled against the walls. Kano found himself in the center of the car. He was the only one who kept his wits about him and met Arlen with a thrust of a sharpened rebar. The iron scraped against his cracked ribs, and the world turned white with pain. Arlen lunged forward with the pain and struck from below with his baton into Kano's exposed armpit. Kano collapsed. The fight was over. The registry dispassionately recorded the result. Car 17 had established control over Car 16. Car 17's ranking rose by 112 positions. There were 63 prisoners, of whom barely half were capable of fighting. The rest in Car 16 turned out to be the same starving passengers whom Kano had kept in the black car. Arlen ordered the wounded to be treated, the food to be pooled, and the rebar to be gathered. He told the prisoners one simple thing: those who work eat on equal terms with everyone else. Anyone who carries rebar on their back will get off at the next stop without shoes. They listened in silence. Then, an old woman from Car 16 asked if they could really eat twice a day now. Mira replied that they could, and that worked better than any speech. By the end of the stop, Theo called Arlen to the far end of Car 16. The panel to the next car was ajar, and darkness lay beyond it. Car 15 was marked in gray on the registry chart. Arlen grabbed his baton and a flashlight powered by salvaged batteries and went in first. The empty car smelled of dust and old misery. The seats stood untouched. Belongings lay scattered on the floor, tossed there in haste. On the wall near the middle row, someone had scratched out a few lines. Arlen shone the flashlight on them. The inscription stated that the train does not carry passengers, but selects them. That the seats, with a warm heart, mark the heirs. That there are 12 such seats in the train, and that the conductors at the front of the train hunt down the marked ones. Below that, an arrow pointing toward the front of the train, and a single word had been scratched in: run. Arlen showed the inscription on the wall only to his own people. Holt read the lines 3 times and said that now both the seat's generosity and the questions from the front of the train made sense. The chair isn't a gift. The chair is a target pinned to your back. Mira asked what we were going to do. Arlen replied that there was nowhere to run on the train, which meant we had to become too valuable to hunt. 3 cars, 150 people. That's no longer prey. This is the price. The work began that very hour and continued for 3 days of travel through the mist. The first phase of this work looks like this. Ortega, along with a dozen of Kano's former fighters, dismantled the seats in Car 15 and used the frames to forge window grills and a second set of barricades on a makeshift forge. Sparks flew up to the ceiling, and the people who, just a week ago, had been killing one another were now working together piece of material. The second scene looked like a school. Holt marked out a wall with charcoal and taught 3 dozen people to read the registry table, count units, and maintain the exchange log between the cars. The old man yelled at the slackers like a sergeant major, yet beamed like a little boy. The third scene looked like an assembly line. Mira selected 6 assistants and herded all the wounded from both cars through the infirmary, while Theo, with 2 nimble guys from the 16th, organized the collection of resin knots right at the berths through the window on Arlen's rope without stepping out into the line of fire. The fourth section was the quietest. Every hour, Arlen would place his palm on the armrest and the chair would pay up. A rope, an axe, a box of nails, a packet of salt that the registry had valued at 4 units. Salt had become the #1 currency throughout the entire train. At the end of the 3rd day, there was a knock at the front door of car 17. Polite, 3 times. Standing outside the door was a delegation of 3 people, holding a white rag on the handle of a mop. It was led by a woman in her 40s with a military bearing and cold gray eyes. She introduced herself as Selma, the negotiator for the union of cars 9 through 11. Selma entered, and her expression made it clear what she had been expecting. She had expected a filthy hovel with a field commander enthroned on a throne of looted goods. That was what the entire rear of the train looked like. She walked past the bars on the windows, and her eyebrow twitched. She saw a wall covered in charts and a line of Holt students and slowed her pace. She saw the infirmary with clean bandages and a line for hot meals where people from car 16 stood, mixed in with people from car 17, and she stopped completely. Then she looked at Arlen and said she'd gone to speak with the bandit, but it looked like she'd be talking to the mayor instead. Skepticism washed off her face like water. Selma laid out the situation. The union was offering the tail cars in exchange and joint reconnaissance of the stops. But the real reason for the visit was different. She lowered her voice and said that an order was making its way from the head of the train down through the cars. Conductors are buying up information about the car, where a man in glasses lifted 2 cars with his bare hands in a week. They're offering food in exchange for the information. For the man himself, they're promising a luxury car with running water. She said the union had no intention of selling Arlen out because a strong tail car benefits everyone, but someone else would definitely sell him out. Arlen thanked her in an even voice while a cold timer ticked away beneath his ribs. There was less time left than he'd thought. Selma left with an exchange agreement and a small bag of salt as a token of goodwill. And that night, the armchair made a move Arlen hadn't expected. The armrest didn't just get warm, it became so red hot that Arlen jerked his hand away. The click wasn't a click, but a thud. The recess swung open to its full width, and the light from inside wasn't reflected, but its own. Lying in the niche was a staff, an elbow's length long, made of white metal without a single seam. A thin golden line of the same unfamiliar letters as those on the torch ran along its edge. No sooner had Arlen's fingers closed around the rod than the register spoke, but not in the car, in his head. The voice had changed. It was closer and older. The voice announced that the legendary artifact, the conductor's key, had recognized its bearer. The key grants the right to claim ownership of abandoned train cars from a distance, and the right to open any intercar doors except the end doors. Then the voice paused and added something that made the back of Arlen's neck go stiff. The voice said that the selection protocol had entered its open phase. The train wasn't carrying passengers, it was carrying candidates. The final destination was a new world that would receive a single ruler and his people. The 12 marked seats represented 12 contenders. 7 remained. The key holder was now visible to everyone. And at that very moment, the car's main panel lit up on its own. A table was displayed on it, and in the table, opposite the line for car 17, a golden symbol pulsed. Arlen looked up and saw identical panels glowing through the open doors of cars 16 and 15. This meant that the panels were now lit in all 415 cars. The entire train was displaying the same line. The car exchanged glances and fell silent. Holt was the first to voice what everyone had realized. There was no point in hiding anymore. A minute later, the communication panel by the door, which no one had ever seen in operation before, sprang to life. The text of an incoming message scrolled across it. The sender was listed as the head of the conductor's service. The text was as brief as a death sentence. The key carrier from car 17 is ordered to report to the lead section voluntarily within 3 stops. In case of refusal, the rear of the train, from car 13 onward, will be uncoupled at the next world. The registry immediately helpfully displayed information about the next stop's world. Highest danger class. The survival rate for passengers outside the train is 0.0. Arlen stared at the number 0 and heard the 150 people behind him stop breathing. He gripped his wand so tightly that the golden line flashed. Then he turned to his crew and said that the conductors had made a mistake. They'd shown that they were afraid. And they'd also forgotten that there were 400 cars between the head and the tail, and that now the tail had the key to every door. 3 stops. That was all the time they had, and Arlen divided it into hours, just as he had once divided delivery schedules. He assembled a council of his own people, and Selma, whom he called up via the communication panel. The panel worked between the cars if you knew the code for the line in the table, and Holt had already memorized that system by heart. Arlen laid out the situation without sugarcoating it. Going to the front voluntarily meant disappearing. Not going meant leaving everyone from car 13 onward vulnerable to being uncoupled. Fighting the conductors head-on wouldn't work because no one knew how strong they were. That left a third option, to make it so that uncoupling the tail would cost the front more than making a deal with it. Selma asked how the tail could be valuable to the head. Arlen replied, through contributions. The registry collected units from each car, and those units went somewhere. If the tail contributed a third of the train's total contributions, cutting it off would be financial suicide for the head's budget. Holt whistled and said that to account for a third, they'd have to control not 3 cars, but 30. Arlen nodded and picked up the conductor's key. He said there were 41 gray rows in the table and that abandoned cars could be taken without a fight. They began right away. The key worked simply. Arlen touched the control panel with his wand, selected a gray row, and the row flashed gold with a note transferring rights to car number 17. But the right on paper was worthless without people inside, so they moved out in a column. Ortega led 20 fighters with lattice shields made from chair frames. Behind them came Holt's accountants and 2 of Mira's assistants. Teo ran ahead through the ventilation ducts, listening for what lay behind the doors. The first gray car, number 14, turned out to be empty and intact. The second, number 12, greeted them with the stench of death and claw marks on the walls. Something had broken in at the station and gnawed the car down to the bone. They gathered their things in silence. The third gray car was the worst of all. There, people had died not from claws but from thirst because they couldn't pay their dues, and the registry had sealed the doors forever. Holt aged about 5 years on those thresholds. He said he now understood why Arlen needed a third of the train, not for trade, to ensure that nothing like this ever happened anywhere again. By the end of the first stop, the 17th had 11 cars at its disposal. The empty ones were filled with people surplus from the overcrowded ones. In each one, Arlen left a 3-person crew, seniority first, the accountant, the medic. The rules were posted everywhere, identical, written in charcoal on the wall. Those who work get to eat. The ledger is open to everyone. Only the shift on duty carries weapons. People from other cars read them and didn't believe it. Then they ate hot meals twice a day and began to believe. At the second stop, what Arlen had been waiting for and fearing happened. The main move. An announcement from the conductor service went out over all the train's panels. Cars that had assisted the keybearer were declared accomplices in the mutiny and stripped of the right to purchase water at the internal rate. The calculation was dirty and precise. Water was the train's Achilles heel. The cars didn't have their own water supply and bought it from the registry for credits. The display panels were still lit up with the text, and by 5 p.m., delegations from neighboring cars were already knocking on the door with a single question. What are we supposed to drink now? Arlen went out to meet them with an answer he'd prepared in advance. Over the past few days, the chair had twice produced items that he hadn't initially understood the purpose of. A ceramic cylinder with a porous filling and a flexible hose with a bulb. Mira recognized the cylinder as a fine filtration filter, and at every stop beneath the embankment, they found water. Swamp water. Rusty. Dead-looking. In a single go, Ortega assembled a station capable of processing 30 buckets an hour using the hose and filter from the barrel. The first bucket of filtered swamp sludge came out as clear as glass. Arlen was the first to drink a mugful, right in front of the delegations. Then he handed the mug to the loudest skeptic in the 9th car, a mustachioed mechanic named Gruber, who had been repeating the whole way that without the conductors, everyone would die. Gruber sniffed the water like a sapper. He drank in small sips. Then he looked at the barrel, at the filter, and at Arlen, and said quietly that he'd been repairing water trucks for 20 years and had never seen filtration like this, not even in the city. His mustache twitched. He turned to his companions and barked that the conductors, with their training, could drink you-know-what. The tail received water, and along with it, the answer to the question of who was really in charge here. By the third stop, marked with the golden number 17, there were 26 cars and nearly 2,000 people. The tail's contributions, according to the registry table, amounted to 29% of the train's total revenue. Arlen looked at that figure and realized that they were just a little short of a third, and that the conductor's term was expiring today. The communication panel lit up exactly at midnight, according to the internal clock, but the message did not come from the head. The sender was listed as car number 208 from the middle of the train. The text was short, and a chill ran down Arlen's spine. It was written by another carrier. He called himself Wayne and reported that his seat was also targeting an heir, and that the conductors had offered him a deal. The head would forgive Wayne everything and hand over the tail to him if he brought them the conductor's key and the head of its owner. Wayne wrote that he'd thought it over and decided to ask Arlen himself what he would offer in return. There was a postscript at the bottom. He had until the end of the next stop to think it over. After that, Wayne would choose a side. And his side had already taken control of 40 cars in the middle. The council gathered around the train layout that Holt had drawn in charcoal across the entire wall of the command car. The tail was in gold, the head was in black. The middle was in a gray fog, and within that fog, Wayne's 40 cars stood out like a foreign fist. Selma said they couldn't make a deal with Wayne because a man who trades away an ally's head would sell out the buyer as well. Ortega said that in that case, they'd have to prepare for a war on two fronts. Holt remained silent, tapping his finger on the number 40. Then he said that 40 cars in the same time it took them to get 26 was either genius or a lie. Arlen thought about a third possibility, about how Wayne had written his letter. A man confident in his power doesn't ask what will be offered to him. He issues an ultimatum. Wayne had asked. So something about his 40 cars wasn't right. Arlen ordered Theo to take 2 guys and go scout out the ducts and roofs up to the 200s. Mira protested, saying the boy was 14. Theo replied that he was almost 15 and that an adult would get stuck in the duct. That was true, and the truth prevailed. The 3-day journey to the camp passed in a fever of preparation. The chair was working for both war and peace at the same time. The clock gave a box of candles. An hour yielded a can of oil. Then the chair produced an object that took Holt's breath away. A compact printing press with a typecase full of letters from an unfamiliar alphabet that rearranged themselves under the typesetter's hand. Holt printed the first sheet of the Tales newspaper, featuring the union's rules, a table of dues, and a list of what the union buys and sells. The sheets were distributed throughout the train cars and did more for the Tales' reputation than 100 of Ortega's billboards. People in the middle of the train passed the sheets from hand to hand. The written word on a train where there was nothing but rumors struck harder than a truncheon. Theo returned at the end of the 3rd day, thin as a splinter and with eyes full of loot. He crawled his way to car 210 and saw everything. Wayne's 40 cars were held together not by order, but by fear. The food was collected by a guard of about 50 thugs and distributed according to proximity to the leader's body. In the far cars of his zone, people were wasting away from hunger, while the central car's storerooms were full. And most importantly, Theo saw Wayne's chair itself. 4 guards carried it behind the leader like a throne. It had been cut out of the car along with a section of the floor, and the chair was cold. In 3 hours of observation, it yielded not a single clue. Holt was the first to piece it together. Wayne had yanked the chair from its place and broken something. His source had dried up, or was nearly dry. That was why he was asking, rather than demanding. His 40 cars were a bubble sustained by past reserves and fear. Arlen looked at the map and saw not a front line, but a market. A starving heartland with a tyrant at the top. That wasn't an enemy army. It was 2,000 future allies who just needed to be shown that things could be different. The plan took shape by morning. At the staging area, the Alliance would send neither fighters nor diplomats to Wayne. The Alliance would send a caravan. The campsite was situated in a world of a shallow, warm sea, knee-deep beneath a white sky. The registrar announced 3 o'clock. A procession the train had never seen before emerged from the rear doors. 40 people with wheelbarrows made from chair frames, barrels of clean water, boxes of salt, baskets of dried fish caught with rope nets right at the last stop, and sheets of newspaper on top of each load. The caravan passed along the outside of the train as far as car number 200 and came to a halt in front of Wayne's cars. Arlen climbed onto a wheelbarrow and spoke briefly. The Tale sells food and water in exchange for labor and goods. The Tale accepts anyone who leaves Wayne empty-handed. The first 10 families receive rations free of charge. There was a minute of silence. Then a skinny man with a child in his arms climbed out of the window of car number 212 and waded through the water toward the caravan. Behind him came a woman. Behind her, 3 more. Wayne's guards poured out onto the embankment with their rebar and stood between their cars and the caravan. And then what Arlen had bet everything on happened. The hungry crowd at the windows stared at their enforcers and at the strangers' food. The math was clearer than ever. The senior guard, nicknamed the Hammer, turned toward the windows, looked at the faces behind the glass, then at the crates of fish. Then he threw the rebar into the water and said that he'd been hired to protect people, not to starve them. He was the first to approach the cart and grab a sack in exchange for his promise to help with the unloading. Half the guard followed him. The bubble burst without a single blow. Wayne jumped out onto the embankment on his own. A huge red-faced man in a fine coat with a gold chain made from someone's confiscated valuables. He bellowed that they were all traitors, that the chair would give him a legendary weapon, and that he would burn them all. He shook his cold throne by the armrest in full view of everyone. The chair remained silent, and that silence killed his power once and for all. People walked out of his cars, passing him as if he were a void. By the end of the stop, 31 cars in the middle section had posted a request on their panels to switch to the gold designation. Arlen approved them one line at a time with his key and watched as the table changed color. Vena was left untouched. He locked himself in his car with 9 loyal followers, and that night, his line turned gray on its own, marked for voluntary disconnection at the next track junction. Not even the registry knew where such branches led. Holt tallied the results against the wall. 58 cars, 4,500 people. 38% of the train's total contributions. The one-third target had been exceeded, and at that very moment, all the train's panels flashed and went dark. Then they lit up again, but the table displayed on them was already different. The registry announced an update to the selection protocol. The trading phase is complete. The testing phase begins. Each of the remaining carriers is scheduled for a personal inspection at the next stop. Failure to appear is considered a renunciation of inheritance, resulting in the purging of all controlled cars. At the bottom of the display, the number of remaining contenders was highlighted. There were now 5. The test didn't announce the conditions in advance, and that was the worst part. Arlen prepared for anything and everything at once. Ortega packed him an assault pack, a rope, a hook, a first aid kit, a filter in a small case, and 3 days' worth of dry rations. The chair had yielded 2 items the night before the stop, and both fit into the pack like a glove. A flat self-heating canteen and goggles with thick yellow lenses that turned darkness gray. Mira rebandaged his old ribs tightly, as if for battle. Holt was appointed regent with a simple order. If Arlen doesn't return before departure, the Alliance will continue to follow the rules and send no one after him. Theo sulked and remained silent in the corner because his brothers had forbidden him 3 times. The convoy crept into a world that the registry had designated as an inheritance testing ground. Outside the windows lay a dead city of black stone. The streets faded into the fog. Silent green lightning hung over the city, never fading. The display panel in Car 17 lit up with a personal directive. The bearer is to arrive at the tower in the city center alone. Retrieve the contender's seal from the tower. Time until departure, 4 hours. Any form of escort will result in failure. Arlen stepped out onto the black cobblestones alone. The door behind him hissed and closed. The city's silence was as thick as water. He walked down the main street, counting the turns. The goggles from the chair showed the silhouettes of houses in the fog, and something else. Thin threads stretched across the alleys at knee height. He crouched down by the first thread and examined it. The string led into the walls, and bone bells hung from it. An alarm. So there was someone here to listen. He stepped over the threads one by one, and by the 4th, he understood the pattern. The strings were placed only along convenient, short routes. Someone had known in advance how a man in a hurry would proceed and had set traps based on the human logic of haste. Arlen veered off the convenient path and took a long detour through the ruins. 2 blocks away, he heard the first scream, a distant male voice full of rage and pain. Then a brief clang of iron against stone, then silence. He didn't head toward the sound. He memorized the direction and pressed on. He saw the tower from the square, a black 30-story spire with a single entrance and a green lightning bolt above the spire. And he also saw the purpose of the trial. 4 streets led to the square from all 4 sides, and along the other 3, people were heading toward the tower, far apart from one another, one by one. The trial had brought all the bearers to a single point for a single seal. The registry didn't say there were multiple seals. The math suggested the worst. There was only 1 seal. Arlen took off his glasses, wiped them, and put them back on. A woman was walking down the street on the left, carrying a spear made of 2 pieces of rebar welded together. She moved like a soldier. On the right walked a young man, almost a boy, and his hands burned with a blue fire that didn't scorch his sleeves. Fire from the chair, Arlen realized. A legendary object fused with the body. No one was walking on the far street, but the fog there swelled and subsided like breath. The young man with the fire was the first to reach the tower's doors. He was faster than anyone else, and was the first to fall into the city's trap. Bony strings shot out from beneath the plaza slabs, forming a net that ensnared him like a fly. The blue fire cut through the strings, but two more sprang up in place of each one. Something that breathed emerged from the fog on the distant street. The Guardian of the Square, a 4-human-height assembly of the city's bones, with bells in place of joints. It walked toward the entangled boy as unhurriedly as a reaper. The woman with the spear stopped at the edge of the square, and Arlen saw her plan. While the Guardian was occupied with the boy, she could slip through the doors. It was a sound, cold calculation. Arlen made a different one. He remembered the crawler on the ashen plain, and how the eyeless creature had been drawn to the noise and heat. Bells. The whole city was listening. He yanked the self-heating flask from his knapsack, turned the heat up to the max, and hurled it in an arc toward the far corner of the square. The flask sang with heat and clattered against the stone. The Guardian stood up. The bells in its joints turned toward the sound and the heat. The bone tower turned and walked away from the boy toward the flask. Arlen was already running, not toward the doors, toward the boy. The knife cut the strings right at the slabs, where they emerged from the groove and didn't split. The young man stared at him with wild eyes and asked why. Arlen replied that they would be killed one by one, in turn. They severed the last string together. The woman with the spear was already standing in the tower's doorway, watching them. Then she said, "Stupidity is contagious," took 3 steps back, and hurled her spear into the Guardian's bell-shaped knee as he spun back from the now cool flask. The joint burst. The 3 of them rolled through the tower's doors, and a bony palm crashed against the stone behind them. Inside was a spiral staircase, and they ran up it for 30 floors in silence, conserving their breath. At the top was a circular hall, and in the hall, on a pedestal, lay a seal. Just one. A black disc with a gold inscription around the rim. The 3 stood around the pedestal, breathing heavily. The woman introduced herself as Iris from car 90. The young man introduced himself as Solo from car 301. It is said there was nothing to share and that she wouldn't let this chance slip away. Solo lit up his palms. Arlen didn't move. He looked at the seal and read the gold inscription around its rim. The letters were the same as those on his key, and over the past week, he'd learned to guess their meaning by their shape. He read it aloud. The seal recognizes the hand, but serves the union of hands. Then he told them both what he'd realized himself a second ago. The test isn't about who can run the fastest. The city killed loners, and loners had already perished on its streets. The test is about whether the future ruler is capable of forging an alliance among rivals. The registry was testing the same thing everywhere. It asked if the 3 of them were ready to take on the seal together. Edis looked into his eyes for a long time. Solo closed his palms first. 3 hands rested on the black disc simultaneously. The seal flashed and split into 3 thin discs of its own accord. The hall trembled. The register's voice resounded in all 3 minds at once. The trial had been passed in the manner prescribed for the heir. Of the 5 contenders, 3 remained. The others were eliminated. The bearers have the right to unite the domains or continue separately. The return path is clear. The descent was easy because the Guardian in the square lay as a heap of silent bones. At the fork in the streets, Iris stopped and said that her 90 cars would link up with the tail via the panel tomorrow. Solo said that his 301st was small and destitute, but that he could do what no one else could, and he showed a blue spark on his fingers. They went their separate ways to their doors. Arlen entered the 17th car 8 minutes before departure, and 4,500 people exhaled in unison. And that night, the communication panel received a message with no signature and no car number. The text was typed in the same gold letters as those on the key and the seal. The sender wrote that he had been watching the square and was satisfied, that the conductors were a glitch, not a authority, and that if the key's bearer wanted to know what was actually awaiting the train at the terminal station, he should check his armrest within the next hour, especially carefully. Arlen woke up Holt and Mira and sat down in seat 33 in front of the witnesses. If the armrest had a surprise in store, let sober eyes see it. The hour dragged on like tar. The warmth arrived exactly on schedule, but the clicks sounded different, deeper, as if a door had opened rather than a compartment. What lay in the niche was not an object. In the niche lay a thin plate of black glass, and golden lines were already running across it. Arlen picked up the plate, and the lines formed a text that shifted before his eyes, answering questions before he even had time to ask them. It was not an object. It was an archive. The plate identified itself as the memory of the first conductor and told him everything. The train was built by a dying civilization as both an arc and a sieve. The worlds along the tracks are filters. The final station is a living world, empty and ready. The registry is the engineer and the judge. The 12 warm seats are its tools of selection, and the conductors were not the train's crew. 300 years ago, they were passengers just like the others. Their carrier reached the top first in his selection cycle, killed the other contenders, and attempted to take control by force. The registry could not punish him because the winner had formally fulfilled the conditions, but it could not crown the murderer either because the protocol required a ruler, not an executioner. The selection process came to a standstill. The crew walked the ring. The descendants of that host became conductors and, for 300 years, parasitized off the contributions, killing every new marked one before they could gain power. Cycle after cycle. The disc displayed the cycle numbers, and the sight of those numbers made Arlena feel queasy. Their current group of passengers was the 29th. At the bottom of the archive, the last line glowed. The malfunction could only be rectified by a new, completed selection process. The heir must enter the control section with the seal and the key and present his credentials directly to the registry. Then the conductors will lose their status and the train will open the terminal station. Arlen read aloud, and the command car was so silent that the fog outside the windows could be heard. Holt was the first to state the obvious. The conductors know all this better than anyone. That's why they need the key and the carrier's head before the carrier reaches the head on its own. So now it won't be a hunt. It will be a war of annihilation. The war had come sooner than expected. Within a day's journey, the Union's control panels were flooded with messages from the middle cars. Armored men were moving down the train from the front. Not a guard made up of passengers. Real conductors in black overcoats with silver batons that made the intercar doors open on their own. There were 26 of them. They did not loot, nor did they leave garrisons behind. They moved like a knife through the train toward the rear, dragging 3-wheeled cages on chains. Inside the cages sat creatures from the ash plains, creepers that had been tamed. Selma rushed into headquarters with a map. At their current speed, the conductors would reach the Union border in 2 days. The council was divided. Ortega demanded they fight on their own ground in the narrow passages of the barricades. Molot proposed dismantling the passageways and meeting the enemy in the gaps between the cars. Iris, speaking over the communications panel, advised retreating to the rear and stretching the enemy's forces. Arlen listened and looked at the map, seeing what he always saw: logistics. 26 fighters and 3 beasts were a force for breakthrough, not for defense. They could win any single point, but couldn't be at every point. And besides, they were passing through the train cars that had paid them Trinity for 300 years and silently hated them. Arlen said they would be met not by a wall, but by emptiness and eyes. The plan was set in motion within a day. All people and valuables were removed from the first 10 cars of the Union's train. The doors were left wide open. Observers from Tio's group took their places in the compartments above the ceilings, equipped with mirrors for signaling. Holt's printing press ran non-stop, and leaflets were distributed ahead along the conductor's entire route. The leaflets revealed who the conductors really were and that the Union's tail was paying for food for every hour the Punishers were delayed. A message from the archives struck at the very heart of their power. They were feared like the masters of the train. The masters turned out to be descendants of a murderer and thieves of Union dues. The conductors entered the empty Union cars at dawn on the 3rd day. Arlen watched them through Theo's eyes via a chain of mirrors. Black overcoats moved through the emptiness, and the emptiness did what a wall would not. It was terrifying. The commander of the punitive force, a tall, gray-haired man with a double silver stripe on his sleeve, stopped the column in the 3rd empty car and spoke at length to his men. Then they unchained the first crawler and sent it forward like a dog. And that's when what Arlen had spent his most precious resource on came into play. The object the chair had given him the day before, a silent whistle that simply caused people's ears to ring. Ortega blew it from the roof above the 4th car. The crawler went berserk. The creature spun around in the narrow passageway and charged on its own. Its animal logic turned out to be simple. The source of the pain was behind it. 2 Punishers fell beneath its paws before the beast was hacked to death with clubs. The formation broke, and at that moment, along the entire length of their retreat, in the cars they had passed through an hour ago, doors slammed shut and iron clanged. This was no battle. It was the passengers in the middle cars, who had read the leaflets, banging on the walls and rolling empty barrels. Noise from all sides, emptiness ahead, a dead beast behind. The commander of the punitive squad was experienced, and therefore made the only correct decision. He turned the column around and led it back toward the front, fighting his way through the cars that had been silent an hour ago, but were now hurling rotten potatoes at their greatcoats. 26 had gone. 23 returned, without a single cage. The 2 remaining crawlers were left locked up, and Ortega was already thinking about what to do with them. The Union celebrated for 3 days. Arlen did not celebrate. He sat poring over the archive disc, asking it question after question about the head section. The disc responded sparingly. The head section is subordinate to the registry. There is one entrance for the air, through Car 0, and in response to the direct question of how many conductors there were in total, the disc displayed a line that sent a chill down even Ortega's spine as he read over Arlen's shoulder. The control section houses a combat crew of 211 people, a full arsenal of the first conductor, and in the last line, the disc added something that hadn't been asked. According to the route calculation, there were 11 stops remaining until the final station. 11 stops. That was the entire horizon. And Arlen broke it down into parts, as always. Against the 211 trained fighters in the fortified front car, the Union could field a massive force, but sheer numbers meant nothing in the narrow train cars. 3 things mattered: the unity of the domains, weapons, and the route to Car 0, which wouldn't have to be fought through 200 doors. The first section was secured within 2 stops. A meeting of the 3 carriers was arranged at the neutral 100th marker. Iris brought her 90 cars into the Alliance in their entirety and turned out to have been a mountain rescue captain in a past life, which explained both her spear and her temperament. She accepted the Alliance's council as its charter and demanded only one thing. She would lead the assault group on the head section together with Arlen, because 2 commanders with different perspectives see twice as much. Solo arrived with his meager 301st and a gift that changed everything. His blue flame cut through metal without heating the surrounding area. Doors opened at his touch within a minute, without a sound or a spark. The seals of the 3 contenders were placed together on the table, and they merged of their own accord into a single disc bearing 3 golden lines. The registry responded immediately and announced to the entire train that the air's domains had been united and that the unified domain encompassed 152 cars and 11,000 people. A third of the table's length turned gold. The second third was obscured by the chair. And not just the chair. Arlen had noticed the change long ago, but now it had become the system. The randomness of the objects had vanished. The armchair seemed to read the war plan through his palm. The clock provided a skein of fire-resistant fabric. The clock provided a box of caps. Ortega and Gruber had set up a veritable armory workshop in the 15th car. From fittings and caps, scrutin grenades were born. Smoke screens were made from filters and masks. Crossbows capable of firing bolts through 2 doors were fashioned from chair springs. Mira prepared medical trios and studied the golden protocols from the field surgery archive plate. Holt was no longer printing leaflets, but floor plans of the main section, which the plate had rightfully handed over to the air. On the plans, Car 0 lay behind the barracks, behind the armory, and behind the engineers section, with a single shoulder-width corridor leading to it. A head-on approach was suicide, even with Solo's fire. The enemy had gifted the third part. At the 7th stop, a man emerged from the front of the train toward the Union, holding a white rag. A young conductor without a baton, his eyebrows split open. He introduced himself as Darius and said that the crew had split. The commander, a gray-haired veteran who had been driven back by the void, reported the truth to higher-ups about the leaflets and the fact that the train was no longer afraid. The higher-ups responded with an order to prepare a total sweep, detaching half the train. And then some of the younger crew members refused. This wasn't what their grandfathers had chosen. 36 people are under arrest in the 6th car of the lead section. Darius fled through a maintenance niche under the floor that the punitive forces had forgotten about because no one had used it in 300 years. A maintenance niche. Arlen and Iris leaned over the blueprints at the same time. The blueprint confirmed it. Running the entire length of the train beneath the floor was the first conductor's maintenance hatch, narrow as a coffin and covered at the front by a single grate. A grate, not a door with a key lock. The council had argued about Darius all night. "It's a trap!" Hammer shouted. "Let's check it out," Arlen replied. Holt came up with the test, and it was brutal in its simplicity. They let Darius write a letter to his arrested comrades and sent it through Theo via the monitored mail chutes. If security in the 6th car is tightened after the letter, then Darius is the bait. Theo returned 2 days later and reported. Security hadn't been tightened. The detainees' water rations had been cut, and Theo also brought back their reply, scrawled on a wrapper. The reply stated that when the action began outside, they would break through the wall from the inside. The assault was scheduled for the 9th stop. The registry described this location as a fissure in a gigantic cave where the train would come to a halt on a bridge over an abyss for 4 hours. The conductors would be unable to receive reinforcements from the outside and would be unable to uncouple the tail section on the bridge. There was no better opportunity. The plan unfolded in 3 phases. The first prong, a diversion. Ortega, with 200 shields and the full force of the arsenal, strikes the front section head-on through the intercar doors and ties up the garrison. The second prong, Iris, with 50 assault troops and the freed prisoners from Darius, strikes the rear of the arsenal from the 6th car as the prisoners you break through the wall. The third arrow is Arlen himself, along with Solo, Theo, and a dozen of the best, moving through a maintenance hatch under the floor to the grate beneath Car 0. Solo cuts through the grate. Arlen enters with a key and a seal and presents his credentials to the registry before the top conductors realize where the real attack is coming from. The night before the stop, Arlen made his rounds through his cars. 11,000 people were awake. They were carving, painting, praying, and writing letters with no addresses. He lingered by seat 33 and placed his palm on the armrest, off schedule. And for the first time ever, the seat broke its schedule. The metal warmed instantly. A click sounded like a gunshot. In the niche lay an object that Arlen had neither asked for nor expected. The conductor's silver baton, but older and heavier than their batons, with a gold band running its entire length. The archive plate glowed on its own in his pocket and displayed a single phrase. The first conductor's baton unlocks what the key has no right to unlock. Arlen stood in the dark car, holding his own right in one hand and someone else's legacy in the other, listening as the train rumbled across the bridge toward the 9th platform. Then he tucked both wands under his jacket and went to rouse the assault teams. Outside the windows, the abyss of the fault line was already growing lighter. The announcer announced the stop in an even voice. 4 o'clock. Doors unlocked. Ortega, in the lead car, raised his shield and struck the door first. Ortega's blow against the front door of the lead section sounded like a signal for the entire train. 200 shields stormed into the first car of the lead section amid the roar of stun grenades and the clang of crossbow bolts against black greatcoats. The conductor's garrison met them with a tight and well-coordinated defense. Silver wands flashed arcs of light that burned right through the seat frames. Ortega lost 3 men within the first few meters and retreated a step, exactly as planned. His mission was not to break through. His mission was to draw as many wands as possible toward himself, and he did. A curtain of smoke crept through the cars, and within the smoke, the shields would advance and then retreat, forcing the garrison to pull its reserves back toward the front door. Meanwhile, a third arrow crept beneath the train's floor through a maintenance hatch. The hatch was indeed a coffin, just as the plaque had promised. Arlen's shoulders rubbed against the walls. Theo crawled ahead with a lantern. Behind him were Solo and 10 fighters. The air smelled of 300-year-old dust and iron. Every 10 meters, the access hatch was crossed by bulkhead ribs, and they had to squeeze through each one, exhaling completely as they did so. Above, the sound of Ortega's battle thudded dully. Then the sound of the battle split in 2. A second flash erupted to the left and closer. This meant that Darius's prisoners had broken through the wall and Iris had entered into the 6th car. The second arrow flew. Arlen crawled, counting the bulkheads. According to the plan, the grate under Car 0 was located past the 42nd rib. At the 38th rib, the hatch ahead lit up, not with Theo's lantern, but with a strange, steady light streaming through a crack in the floor. Theo froze and extinguished his lantern. Boots were visible through the crack. Lots of boots. And Arlen heard a voice he recognized from Darius's description before he could make out the words. The senior service supervisor, the head of the conductors. His voice was eerily calm, and he was speaking into a communication panel. He said that the rebellious rabble was stuck in the first car, that the dissidents were locked in the 6th car with their new friends, and that the reserve unit had already set out to flank them across the roof to cut off the tail of the assault group. Then the voice added a phrase that made Arlen's breath catch in his throat. The supervisor said they'd deal with the crawl space right away, and that he'd personally welded shut the grate at the 0 level 10 years ago. There was no trap. It was just the old paranoia of a veteran predator who'd spent 300 years waiting for guests to arrive from all sides at once. A hatch 3 meters behind the group swung open, and light, along with the first arc from a staff, flooded into the passage. The fighter bringing up the rear screamed and fell silent. In a coffin barely wide enough to turn around in, you can't shoot over your own men's heads. They were about to be roasted one by one like rats in a chimney. Arlen bellowed at Solo to cut a hole in the floor above. Blue fire ripped a square hole in the metal above their heads, and 10 men squeezed out of the hatch right into the feet of the conductor's reserve in the middle of their own corridor. The melee was short and messy. Arc wands at point-blank range, crossbows at point-blank range. Arlen's knife snapped against someone's buckle. Theo crawled between their legs and sank his teeth into the hand holding the rod raised above Solo. By the time the gunpowder smoke reached the ceiling, 6 of the 10 were still on their feet, and the path to zero was blocked by a wall of 8 overcoats led by the Overseer himself. The Overseer was old and thin as a stick, and his staff bore a double gold stripe. He looked at Arlen over the melee and said, almost affectionately, that the key and the seal would now be placed where they had been placed 28 times before. Arlen straightened up and pulled something from under his jacket. Not a key. He pulled out the first guide's staff, and the staff responded to the light of the lamps with its own light. The 8 overcoats froze in their tracks because each of them knew this object from the service's legends. The custodian turned pale and raised his voice for the first time. He shouted that it was a fake and that the relic was lost. Arlen silently pointed the staff toward the side door of the technical compartment, which was locked with a top security staff lock. The door opened on its own, smoothly and obediently, and that was enough. Because behind the 8 figures in overcoats, the clatter had already begun. Iris had fought her way through the armory, and her assault troops, along with Darius's men, had pinned down the reserves from the rear. The custodian found himself caught between a rock and a hard place. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He struck first. A double arc shot point blank at Arlen, and Solo caught it with his crossed, blazing palms. The boy was thrown against the wall, but the arc died in a blue flame. Iris hurled her spear across the entire corridor. The keeper dodged the spear, but couldn't escape the hammer, which simply fell on him with all the weight of former guardsman Wayne. It grew silent. 8 figures in overcoats dropped their staffs, staring at the relic in Arlen's hand. The path to Car Zero was both open and sealed at the same time. The grate beneath it had been disabled 10 years ago, and the only door to Car Zero had no lock at all. The archive plate stated this plainly: Car Zero can only be opened from the inside, only by the will of the registry. Arlen stood before the smooth white door, without a handle or a seam, and raised the conductor's key, the heir's seal, and the first one's staff, and said into the white void that the heir had arrived to assert his rights. For a second, nothing happened. Then, throughout the entire train, from the front to the very last car at the rear, the lights went out all at once. And in the complete darkness of the 415 cars, the voice of the registry sounded, for the first time ever, not from the panels. It sounded from everywhere. The voice said that the claim had been accepted for review, that the review required a final verification, and that the heir must enter alone, without weapons, without the seal, without the key, just him. The white doors silently retracted into the wall, revealing an opening filled with even light. Arlen turned around. Iris was holding the wounded Solo. Theo stared at him with wide eyes and shook his head. Behind them stood fighters and prisoners, and everyone was silent. Arlen took off his jacket with its hidden compartments, placed both wands on the floor, handed the seal to Iris, and stepped into the light with empty hands. The door closed behind him without a sound, and the lights throughout the entire complex came on again. There was no train car inside. Arlen stepped into the light, and the light became a place. He was standing in his own warehouse hangar from a past life, between shelves of shipping documents, and the air smelled of cardboard, dust, and cold coffee. A man was sitting at the reception desk, an ordinary middle-aged man in a gray sweater, with the weary face of a warehouse clerk at the end of his shift. The man looked up, and Arlen recognized in his eyes something that could not be faked: the steady, bottomless attentiveness of the registry. The registry said he had chosen this form from the guest's memory because it was easier to speak among familiar things. He invited Arlen to sit down. Arlen sat across from him, just as he had sat during planning meetings 20 years ago. The registry began without preamble. He said that for 28 consecutive cycles, no one had made it to this room, that the current cycle was the first in which the candidates had shared the seal instead of cutting each other down, that the actual selection criteria had been met. There remained one test that could not be passed by force or intellect, because it tested neither force nor intellect. He placed 3 objects on the table between them, as simply as one might place the keys to a warehouse. First came a golden disc inscribed with the words that it represented: absolute power. peace at the terminal station, and the train and the registry in complete personal subordination, without councils and without heirs to the seal. Iris and Solo lose their status peacefully and harmlessly, but forever. Second came a gray plate inscribed with the words, "Return." The registry acknowledged that it could return any passenger at any moment, 1 second before the train departs. Home, to the old life, with all memories intact. The selection will continue without him, and the train will receive a new chosen one. The third was a plain black token with no inscription. The registry said this represented a shared inheritance in the spirit of what Arlen had done at the tower, a ruler as first among equals, the Council of Seals, power bound by rules that cannot be rewritten to suit oneself, slower, heavier, more contentious. The register added that the choice is neither suggested nor evaluated aloud, and fell silent. Arlen looked at the 3 objects and heard his own heartbeat. The golden disc was an honest temptation. He remembered Barrett in the chair on the first day, and Wayne with his throne carried by the guards, and he understood the nature of this choice. The gray plate struck a deeper chord. Home. The morning before the train. He caught himself unable to remember why he used to wake up there in the mornings. His real life had begun in chair 33. He took the black token. Not because he was a saint. He explained this to the registrar in the same words he would have used to explain it to himself. Power corrupts even good storekeepers without exception. And going back would be desertion from the only place where he was needed. The register nodded, and Arlen thought he saw a fleeting look of satisfaction cross the weary face. Then the register said that the inspection was complete, and that there was one formality left, that he was obligated to show the heir before the coronation. The hangar faded away. They stood in the actual Zero car, among columns of white metal, and the registrar pointed to a transparent capsule against the far wall. An old man was sleeping inside the capsule, a very old man, with a face shriveled to the bone, and resting on his chest was a staff, an exact replica of Arlen's staff. The register said this was the first conductor, the builder of the train. He hadn't died 300 years ago, as the service had believed. He had entered a sleep of waiting when his descendant broke the selection because he could neither execute his own blood nor forgive it. Protocol required the heir to decide the conductor's fate, to awaken him into a world where everything had gone wrong, or to release the capsule into its final, eternal sleep. Protocol did not provide for a third option. Arlen stood by the capsule for a long time. Then he asked the registry if the sleeper could hear him. The registry replied that those on the threshold of sleep can hear everything. Then Arlen leaned toward the glass and told the old man that the train had arrived, that the people down below were building schools in train cars and rationing water by the meter, that his great-grandchildren had laid down their weapons of their own accord today, and that his heir was asking him not for a decision or forgiveness, but for a testimony, to wake up for just one day, to see, and to leave when he himself wishes. The registry was silent for 7 heartbeats. Then he said that there was no such provision in the protocol, but that the judge had the right to interpret it. The capsule hissed. The old man's eyelids fluttered, and at that moment, throughout the entire train, the panels came to life all at once, and the registry's voice announced across 415 cars that the selection for the 29th cycle was complete. The heir had been confirmed. The form of government, the Council of Seals. 9 stops to the final station. Preparations for disembarkation have begun. The door to Car Zero opened, and Arlen stepped out to join his people, leading by the arm an ancient old man who was squinting into the light and weeping silently as he looked at the people. Iris returned the seal. Theo hung onto Arlen's neck, forgetting that he was almost 15. And an hour later, the first price for victory was paid. Darius found Arlen in the command center and reported in a subdued tone that during the sweep of the main section, 9 service personnel were missing, led by the overseer's son, a young conductor named Kale. They had escaped through the roof the moment the lights went out. They hadn't left empty-handed. A container had disappeared from the first conductor's arsenal, bearing a marking that the archive plate translated into 2 words, the uncoupling key. The registry confirmed the worst in a steady voice. The device allows the train to be physically uncoupled on the move at any point, against the registry's will, against the heir's will. 9 people, with hatred instead of a future, vanished among the 400 cars, and they had 9 stops to take revenge on everyone at once. The hunt for the 9 began that very night, and immediately ran up against simple arithmetic. 415 cars, 30,000 people after the unification of all domains under the Council of Seals. 9 people who knew the train better than anyone alive because they'd grown up in its technical guts. Darius laid out everything he knew about Kale before the council, and it looked grim. 22 years old, the best of the young ones, the only one who refused to join the schism, and the only one who sincerely believed that service was a calling of the chosen few. His father had raised him to be the heir to his power, and in a single night, the son lost everything, including his father, whom the hammer had beaten so badly he ended up in the infirmary. A man like that wouldn't bargain. A man like that would wait for the point where the pain from the blow reaches its peak. He didn't have to search long for that point. The registry projected a route map onto the headquarters wall. 2 stops before the final destination, the train passed a great viaduct, a bridge spanning the rift between worlds, 7 hours journey long, where the rails hung over a bottomless void with no right to stop. Uncoupling on the viaduct meant that the severed section of the train would lose traction and power from the lead section and, in 7 hours, would come to a stop where it was forbidden to stop. The archive data confirmed the calculation with cold, hard numbers. The viaduct wouldn't hold sections without traction. Iris asked why they hadn't done this sooner. Arlen answered for Kale because he was already thinking the same way. There were earlier stops and evacuation points. There is no escape on the viaduct. Kale will sever the train right there, and he'll do it so that the tail end, where the school children and everything the Union has built are located, plunges into the abyss. The council adopted a 3-ring defense plan. The first ring consists of people. A head count of everyone on the train will be conducted by the car leaders, with every stranger checked. The second ring consists of equipment. Gruber and his teams inspected the couplings at every junction and placed a security seal on each one, complete with a bell made from the bone strings of the dead city. The third ring is knowledge. Reeser provided the council with diagrams of all technical voids and niches, and Theo's patrols set out through the passageways with lanterns and whistles. For 6 days, the search yielded nothing. 9 shadows did not appear in either the census or the passageways. On the 7th day, 3 stops before the viaduct, a trail emerged, and it was more terrifying than they had expected. In the 200s, a patrol of 2 of Theo's men went missing. They were found a day later in a ventilation chamber, bound but alive. That was the message. A single word had been scratched into the chamber wall with the tip of a staff. Too late. At that very moment, Gruber reported the second half of the message. The seals on the couplers between the 100th and 101st cars were intact, but the coupler itself beneath the seal had already been cut and was held together only by a promise and some camouflage wrapping. They checked further. 4 more couplings along the train had been cut in advance at various points. Kale had no intention of fighting his way to the uncoupling point. He had prepared the train to break apart in advance, and he needed the uncoupling key only as a trigger to cut all the cables at once. The council met for an hour, and Arlen remained silent the entire time, staring at the diagram. Then he said that they were doing everything right, and that was precisely why they would lose. They were protecting the train, but it wasn't the train they needed to defend. He continued speaking slowly, weighing his words. Kale needed 2 things. He had the uncoupling key, but according to the registry's records, the key only works with the engineer's control panel or the manual backup levers on the couplings themselves. The control panel in the lead car was under guard, so the backup controls. And the council now knows every single one of the backup controls on the tampered couplings by heart. Kale is smart and knows that they'll find his tampering, so the real tampering hasn't been found yet. That means they weren't looking in the right place. Arlen turned to the registry and asked if there were any couplings not shown on the general diagrams. The registry was silent for a long time. Then he replied that there was one, the coupling between the 0 car and the rest of the train. It was classified. It could only be disconnected using the first conductor's wand or the uncoupling key. Not even the service knew about it. The builder knew about it, and so did the one who had read the supervisor's personal archive. Silence fell over headquarters. Kale had no intention of letting the tail fall into the abyss. That was too petty. He planned to uncouple the head car on the viaduct, the lead car with the registrar, the arsenal, the conductor's capsule, and the control panel. To send the train's brain forward alone, while leaving 300 years of someone else's work and 30,000 people to roll across the bridge without traction for 7 hours until they came to a stop and fell. Not revenge, but a recreation. Alone in his mind, he would have reached the final destination and received an empty, new world. The blood of the overseers is not for sale. It is inherited. Less than 2 days remained until the viaduct. Arlen issued orders that the council approved without debate. Gruber is openly and noisily repairing all the severed couplings so that Kale believes the game is being played around them. Patrols are demonstratively being pulled back to the rear. and the real trap is being set up around the zero zone crossing. Silent, one of the best. Iris Hammer, Darius Solo, and Arlen himself, both wands in hand. At Arlen's request, the registrar made his final move. He dimmed half the lights in the front section under the pretense of saving energy and left a single, unlocked technical niche near the secret coupling. Perfect for whoever comes to insert the key. The train crept onto the Great Viaduct at dawn. Beneath the windows, a bottomless void opened up, tinged with distant lightning. The clatter of the wheels became as resonant as in a cathedral. The bridge's 7-hour countdown began. At the end of the second hour, the bone bell in the niche by the secret coupling swayed. There was no wind. They surrounded the niche in a circle 8 heartbeats before the strike, following their well-rehearsed plan. Hammer blocked the corridor on the left. Iris stood on the right, spear at the ready. Solo positioned himself right at the coupling, covering the knot with his palms, a knot that must not be released. Darius and Arlen approached the niche from both sides. Sitting in the niche was a man holding the key to the coupling, but it wasn't Kale. It was a boy younger than Theo, wearing a black overcoat borrowed from someone else, and his hands were shaking so much that the key was tapping against his knee. Darius recognized him and gasped. The youngest member of the service, an apprentice. Kale had sent the kid, and in that very second, as everyone stared at the boy, Arlen fully grasped the nature of the trap. They hadn't set the bait. They themselves were the bait. The bell had been rung by someone they didn't care about, and the real blow was coming right now from where their best men had been taken. The communication panel at the end of the corridor lit up on its own, and Kale looked out at them from the screen. A young, lean man with his father's eyes. He was holding a second object in the frame that no one knew about, a handheld duplicate of the engineer's control panel, removed from his father's body in the infirmary. The very infirmary Kale had entered an hour ago using the old service code. He said calmly that he thanked the council for gathering the entire leadership in a single dead-end compartment of the lead section, that the section doors would now close according to the warden's code, and that the uncoupling would happen anyway, but not via the zero coupling they so touchingly guarded, but via all the severed couplings at once, because the duplicate didn't require anyone to approach them on foot. He raised the duplicate to his face and added one last thing. He'll drop the tail with the schools after all, in memory of his father. The corridor doors clanked shut. The backup unit lit up on screen. And then something happened that wasn't in anyone's plans. Not his, not theirs. The boy in the alcove looked up at the sound of Kale's voice, and Arlen saw his eyes. There was no fanaticism in them. There was shame. The child from the service had spent a week in the captured train car, amid Holt's leaflets and lines for hot meals, where no one asked whose blood he was. Arlen didn't take the key away from him. He crouched down next to him, just as he'd once crouched down next to Theo, and said very simply that Kale was about to kill 10,000 children, and that the key in his hands was the only lock that could still be closed in time. The archive disc mentioned this in a single line that Arlen knew by heart. The uncoupling key and the remote control are arguing with each other, and the one who's last in the circuit is right. The boy looked at Arlen for 3 heartbeats. Then he turned toward the coupler, inserted the key into the socket of the backup circuit, and turned it, not to open the circuit, but to lock it. Throughout the entire train, the coupler mechanisms let out a brief howl and fell silent. The backup unit in Kale's hands flashed red on the screen and went dark. The circuit locked with the final key. Kale's expression did not change. He said he respected the decision, and that he had one last argument left, that of old blood. The screen went dark. The registry reported matter-of-factly and menacingly. Kale entered the engine room of the lead section using the inheritance code, which the registry was not authorized to revoke until the end of the current day. The train's acceleration was switched to manual mode. Speed was increasing. At the current rate of acceleration, the estimated time to reach the end of the viaduct was 2 hours instead of 5. Exiting the bridge at that speed was impossible without destroying the track beneath the rear cars. Kale could no longer split up the train, so he decided to crash the entire train, along with himself, into the end of the bridge. Blood that does not inherit leaves no inheritance to anyone. The corridor doors were locked with the conductor's code, and Solo was already cutting through them with blue fire, but the timer was counting down the minutes accurately. They wouldn't make it through the doors and the 300 meters to the lead section with its surviving posts. The only route they could take was the one they'd already traveled, the coffin under the floor. The maintenance hatch ran under the engine room because the first conductor had built it along the entire train. Arlen took off his jacket and crawled into the hatch first. Darius squeezed in behind him because he knew the engine room. The manhole wouldn't let anyone else through at running speed. They crawled for 40 minutes, breathing at their limit amid the growing roar of the train's acceleration. Bulkhead after bulkhead. Above their heads came the rumble of the control stations, then the rumble of the arsenal, then the steady, growing roar of the engines. Darius tapped Arlen on the leg when they reached the right grate. The grate wasn't welded shut. Not even the caretaker knew about it. They squeezed their way into the engine room, into the hot air between the columns of machinery. Kale stood at the control panel with his back turned, one hand on the acceleration lever. He heard them before he saw them and turned around, his father's staff in his free hand. A bolt of lightning struck the column above Darius's head. Arlen stepped out into the open and did something Kale hadn't expected. He set both of his wands on the floor and kicked them aside. Then he told the roaring crowd that he had not come to take anything away, that Kale's father was alive and would live on, that the order would neither be executed nor exiled because the council had already accepted Darius and would accept the rest, that the new world ahead is large enough for the old blood if the old blood chooses to build rather than bury, and that Kale is now the only person in the ranks who can choose for himself without protocols or selection processes. His hand on the lever, 30,000 lives, or his own sense of right and wrong. Kale stood there, and the roar of the engine filled the silence. Then he said quietly that his father had never let him choose. Everything had been decided by blood before he was even born, and that this was the first choice of his life. He took his hand off the lever. The acceleration died down. The train groaned as its brakes engaged along its entire length and began to slow down. Kale placed the control rod on the console, sat down on the floor beside it, and covered his face with his hands. Arlen sat down next to him on the hot metal because his legs couldn't hold him up. An hour later, the train descended from the great viaduct onto the solid embankment of the final stretch, and the registry announced over all the panels that there were 2 stops left until the terminal station. And then he added a phrase that appeared in no protocol. The registry said that for the first time in 29 cycles, he liked what he was carrying. For the last 2 sections, the train traveled as it had never done in 29 cycles. The doors of all the cars remained open from the first to the last, and one could walk right through the entire train, crossing 415 thresholds without ever drawing a weapon, because there were no longer any weapons on their belts. The Council of Seals worked around the clock. Holt and the record keepers were compiling lists of people and trades for disembarkation. 30,112 people. Mira was setting up the First Settlements Hospital. Gruber and Ortega were sorting everything that could be taken along into parts authorized by the registry. Selma was drawing up a resettlement map based on data that the registry had made fully available for the first time. The world they were heading to had an ocean, 2 rivers, and a climate milder than Earth's. The conductor's service ceased to exist in a single evening without a single verdict. The council announced a simple truth. Blood is not judged. Deeds are judged, and deeds will start from scratch on the new land. 36 young people, led by Darius, joined the Union security detail. The elders handed over their seepers to the registry themselves. The overseer woke up in the infirmary under Mira's care, and the first thing he saw was his son, who was sitting next to him and studying the contribution table for the last stop with Theo. The old man wept silently, and no one pretended not to notice. Kale himself asked the council for a job and received the one he requested, the engine room, under the register's supervision. The register was the first to agree. At the second-to-last stop, the crew gathered one last time, and the gathering turned into a celebration. They'd stumbled upon a warm, grassy spot without a single creature within a day's journey. People collected seeds and cuttings according to Holt's lists and simply lay in the grass because many had forgotten what it smelled like over the course of the year. Arlen found the first guide on a hillock. The old man had regained his strength so much over the past few days that he was walking on his own and constantly touching things: the grass, the iron, the children's heads. He told Arlen that he had asked the registry to let him stay in this grassy world, and that the registry had granted his request. The builder did not want to see the final station. He said that the final station belonged to those who had suffered for it, and that he had already built his own. In the morning, the train departed, and on the hill remained a hut built overnight by Ortega and half the assault company, and the old man waved goodbye to the train until the tail end disappeared from view. The final leg of the journey took 3 days, and on the second day, Arlen did what he'd been putting off. He went to the 17th car, to seat 33. The car was empty and clean. Standing guard by the seat was a shift of the honor guard, made up of veterans from the first contingent, a guard that no one had appointed. It had formed on its own. Arlen sat down and rested his palm on the armrest. The metal warmed up for the last time. The click was as quiet as it had been on that first day. A plastic bottle of water lay in the niche. sealed, cold, half a liter, an exact replica of the very first one. Arlen held it and laughed and couldn't stop, and then he noticed something at the bottom of the niche that hadn't been there on the first day. A thin golden line engraved on the metal. The register translated it in a voice quiet enough for only one person to hear. The line stated that the source had fulfilled its purpose and was passing into memory. The chair had grown cold forever, right beneath his palm. Ordinary iron. Arlen placed the bottle back in the niche and asked the registry to leave car 17 as it was, not to dismantle it. The registry replied that it had already entered the car into the inviolable registry of memory, along with the inscription on the wall of Gray 15. At dawn on the third day, the mist outside the windows thinned and burst. The train emerged from the last tunnel between worlds onto a high curve above a green valley. Below lay the world. Two rivers converged in a silver fork. The ocean glowed beneath the low sun on the horizon. Birds flew over the valley in a wedge formation, unafraid of the iron thunder. 30,000 people were pressed against the windows along the entire length of the train, and the train moved through their shared silence as if through water. The registry guided it down the curve as gently as one carries a child. Then came the platform. A real white platform, built 300 years ago for this very moment. The train came to a stop, and the registrar announced their arrival with the words that had apparently been waiting in his memory for all 300 years. He said that the journey was over, that there were no more tracks ahead, and that the doors were opening for the last time. Arlen stepped out first, not because he was the ruler, but because the council had decided so. Someone had to be the first to set foot on the new land, and the council voted unanimously. The grass gave way springily beneath his boots. The air was so fresh he wanted to eat it. The rest of the train poured out in a flood. Iris led the resettlement columns. Solo burned the first clearing with blue fire. Holt was already arguing with Selma about where to build the school. Theo raced past with a gang of kids and shouted as he ran that the river was real. Hammer and Kale were unloading the plows together. Mira was setting up the hospital tents in the shade of the first hill. By evening, the settlement's first bonfire was burning on the hill, and the full council of seals was seated around it, along with the register, whose voice now came from a small panel that Gruber had assembled for him as a body. Arlen asked him what he would do now that the mission was over. The register remained silent for a long time by his standards, a full 3 seconds. Then he said that, for the first time in its existence, he had no protocol, and that he would simply like to keep track of the new world if the council would hire him. Holt was the first to laugh and said the city could handle 2 record keepers. Arlen sat by the fire and looked down at the valley where people from 29 failed cycles, merged into a single people, were walking among the tents. Former passengers, former conductors, former enemies from the car wars. No one paid the fee for the right to live until morning anymore. He remembered the cramped car and the voice demanding 20 units, and himself back then, who knew only how to count and keep silent. The train didn't choose the strongest, he finally understood. All this year, the train had been choosing the one who, in the death car, would begin to share. In the morning, on the white platform, Gruber's people installed an iron plaque cast from the frame of chair 33. The plaque was engraved with the words that here the road ended and the land began. And below that stood a line of text that Theo had proposed and the council had unanimously approved. The line read that the city was called 17th, in honor of the car where strangers first decided to survive together. The train remained standing by the platform as a monument to itself. Its doors never closed again, and for many years to come, the city's children would find a bottle of cold water left behind by one of the elders in seat 33, because the city had developed a tradition to return to where it all began and leave something behind for those who would come after you. That was the end of the story of Arlen Voss, the storeroom attendant from car 17. The story of the 17th was just beginning. They took up positions in the ring within 8 heartbeats, following their well-rehearsed plan. Hammer blocked the corridor on the left with his full weight and a shield made from a double chair frame. Iris stood on the right with her spear at the ready, and her mountain rescuer's eyes were already slicing the darkness of the niche into sectors. Solo took his position right at the coupling, shielding the joint, which could not be surrendered under any circumstances, with his burning palms. Darius and Arlen approached the niche from both sides, moving slowly and gently, just as they'd been taught to take prisoners alive. A man sat in the niche, holding the uncoupling key in his hands, but it wasn't Kale. It was a boy younger than Theo, wearing a black overcoat borrowed from someone else's shoulder, with unfamiliar insignia, and his hands were shaking so much that the key was tapping against his knee, keeping a steady beat. Darius recognized him and gasped aloud. The youngest member of the service, an apprentice named Finn, who was kept in the kitchen and never allowed out of the main section. Kale had sent the kid. And in that very second, while everyone was staring at the boy, Arlen sensed the trap in its entirety, just as one senses poison on the tongue a split second before swallowing. They hadn't set the bait. They themselves were the bait. The bell was rung by someone they didn't mind losing, and the real blow was coming right now, from the very place where all the best had been pulled out. He managed to shout at Iris to check the hallway and didn't have time for anything else. The communication panel at the end of the corridor lit up on its own without being activated, and Kale looked at them from the screen. A young, lean man with his father's eyes, the color of old ice. He was calm, the way people are who have already figured everything out. He was holding in the frame a second object that neither the registry nor Darius nor the archives knew about, the engineer's spare engineer's backup unit. A flat box with a socket and 3 levers, older than the overseer himself. Kale said in an even voice that the duplicate had lain sewn into the lining of his father's overcoat for 300 years as the family's last resort, and that he had removed it from his father's body in the infirmary, which he had entered an hour ago under an old medical protocol that the council had forgotten to revoke. He thanked the council for its predictability, for the fact that the entire leadership of the Union had gathered in a single remote dead end of the main section near the coupling, which he had no intention of touching with his hands. He said that the section's doors would now close using the overseer's personal code, valid until the end of the day, and that the uncoupling would take place anyway, but not here, rather across all 5 severed couplings at once, because the backup unit didn't require him to approach them on foot. The circuit was enough. He raised the backup unit to his face so that it was clear how his finger rested on the middle lever, and added the last part almost expressionlessly. He'll drop the tail with the schools after all, in memory of his father. The corridor doors clanked shut on both sides, cutting off the dead end. The duplicate in the frame glowed with an even white light, taking on a silhouette. The hammer struck the door with a running start, but the door didn't even budge. Solo lunged at the door with fire, but Arlen was already counting the seconds, and by all accounts, it would take longer to cut through 3 fingers of steel than for Kale to squeeze the lever. And then something happened that wasn't in anyone's plans. Not even in Kale's plan, calculated generations in advance, nor in the council's plan. The boy in the alcove looked up at the voice coming from the panel, and Arlen saw his eyes up close. There was no fanaticism of duty in them. There wasn't even fear. There was shame, pure childlike shame that no adult could ever feign. Finn had been living on the captured train for a week, just like everyone else. He'd stood in the communal lines for hot meals, where no one asked whose blood he was. He'd read Holt's leaflets in the cargo holds. He saw Mira bandage the wounded conductor with the same hands she used to bandage the wounded stormtrooper. For 300 years, the service had told its children that passengers were cattle. The cattle turned out to be people who shared their food. Arlen didn't take the key away from him, even though he could have done so in time. Power here was destroying everything. He crouched down next to him, just as he had once done on that first day when he sat down next to Theo by the window and spoke very simply and very quietly, because shouting at a child means you've lost. He said that Kale was about to kill 10,000 children who had no say in the matter, that among them were children just like Finn, that the key in his hands wasn't a weapon but a lock, and that it was the only lock that could still be closed in time. The archive plate had mentioned this in a single line that Arlen knew by heart, and he recited it aloud, word for word. The disengagement key and the remote control are arguing with each other, and the one who entered the circuit last is right. The boy looked at Arlen for 3 heartbeats. Then he looked at the panel where the backup indicator was glowing. Then he turned his whole body toward the coupling, thrust the key into the socket of the backup circuit with both hands because one hand didn't have enough strength, and turned it not to open the circuit, but to lock it all the way in so that his wrists cracked. Across the entire train, from the first to the last car, the coupling mechanisms let out a brief howl and fell silent, locking into a dead stop. The backup circuit in Kale's hands flashed red 3 times on the screen and went out like a blown-out candle. The circuit had locked with the final key. The child had outmaneuvered 300 years of bloodline. Kale's expression didn't change one iota. He looked at Finn with a long, hate-free gaze and said he respected the move, that the boy had chosen faster than he himself had at that age. And then he added that the old blood still had one final argument that depended neither on keys nor on circuits. The screen went dark. There was a moment of silence, and then the floor beneath their feet began to vibrate with a barely perceptible new tremor, and the registry reported, evenly and menacingly, throughout the entire corridor. Kale entered the engine room of the lead section using the hereditary code of the custodian's lineage, which the registry has no authority to revoke until the end of the current day. The train's acceleration has been switched to manual mode. The automatic propulsion system is disabled. Speed is increasing by 2% per minute. At this rate of acceleration, the estimated time to reach the end of the viaduct is 2 hours instead of 5. Derailing from the bridge at this speed would mean the track beneath the rear cars would be destroyed, causing the entire train to collapse. The probability of survival is 0.0. The meaning was clear to everyone without needing to be explained. Kale could no longer cut the train into pieces, so he decided to crash the entire train, along with himself, into the end of the bridge. Blood that cannot pass on leaves no inheritance to anyone. This too was in keeping with the clan's logic, though Arlen realized it 2 hours later than he should have. Solo was already cutting through the door with blue fire, and the steel was weeping in drops. But the plate was counting the minutes honestly and mercilessly. 3 doors. 300 meters of the lead section. The surviving Arsenal guards who were unaware of the coup in the engine room and would put up a fight. There was no way they could make it in time by storming the train. There was only one route left, one they'd already taken and that had nearly become their grave, the coffin under the floor. The first conductor's maintenance hatch ran the entire length of the train, which meant it also ran beneath the engine room, since the engineer used to inspect his engines from below. Arlen took off his jacket so it wouldn't snag, and crawled into the hatch first without asking for advice, because there was no time to argue. Behind him, Darius squeezed in, because he was the only one who knew the engine room by heart from childhood. Malat tried to be the third to go, but got his shoulders stuck in the very first bulkhead and was pulled back by his legs. The hatch wouldn't let anyone else through at running speed. Iris shouted after them into the hatch that she was giving them 40 minutes, and then she'd send all her men to storm the doors, whatever the cost. They crawled those 40 minutes, pushing their breath and tendons to the limit, amid the growing howl of acceleration that vibrated through the metal straight into their bones. Bulkhead after bulkhead. Exhale completely. Squeeze through. Inhale. 300 years worth of dust choked their throats. A rumble from the living quarters passed overhead, followed by the steady chill of the armory. Then the floor above them trembled with a bass vibration, and Darius tapped Arlen on the leg twice at the right grate, just as they'd agreed. The grate gave way on the third blow from his shoulder. Not even the caretaker knew about it, because the caretaker never crawled under his own machines, whereas the builder had been crawling his whole life. They squeezed their way into the engine room, into the hot air that smelled of metal and thunder. The hall was enormous. Columns of machinery stretched up to the ceiling, and flashes of light darted between them. Kale stood at the main control panel with his back to them, his palm resting on the acceleration lever, which was pushed halfway down. He heard them before he saw them, for he was the best of the young ones, and turned around with his father's staff already in his free hand. The first arc struck the column above Darius's head, showering both of them with slag. A second arc did not follow, because Arlen did what the heir of the bloodline did not expect, and could not have expected. He stepped out from behind the column into the open, directly into the line of fire. Slowly, he laid both of his wands on the floor, the conduit's key and the relic of the first, and he kicked them aside so that they flew toward the wall, out of reach. Then he raised his empty palms and spoke loudly and evenly amid the roar of the machines. He said he had not come to take anything away, that Kale's father was alive and would continue to live, and that Mira stood by this with her reputation, that the order would neither be executed nor exiled, because the council had already accepted Darius and his 36 comrades and would accept the rest in the same manner. That the archives had told him about the first selection that had been derailed, and that he understood what burden the lineage of overseers had carried for 300 years, born already guilty, against their will. That the new world ahead was large enough for the old blood, if the old blood chose to build rather than bury, and that right now, Kale was the first person of his kind in 300 years who could choose for himself, without protocols, no selection, no father, his hand on the lever, 30,000 lives down the tracks, or his own righteousness weighing as much as a single wrecked train. Darius stood there, neither alive nor dead, and later said that those seconds felt longer than the entire assault. Kale stood there, the roar of acceleration filling the silence as the speedometer needle crept along. Then he spoke so quietly that he had to be read on his lips. He said that his father had never once in his life let him choose, that everything had been decided by blood before he was even born, who he would be, who he would hate, what he would die for. And that this was the first real choice of his life, and he hadn't even known that a choice could weigh so heavily. He took his hand off the lever, his fingers unclenched one by one. The acceleration died down. The train groaned through its brake circuits along its entire length, from nose to tail, and began to slow down in long, gentle waves. Kale placed his father's wand on the control panel, the handle facing away from him as if surrendering a weapon, sat down on the floor next to the panel, and covered his face with his palms. He wasn't crying. He was simply sitting there the way people sit when the support rod holding up the entire structure has been pulled out from beneath them. Arlen sat down next to him right on the hot metal because his legs wouldn't hold him, and they sat there together like that while Darius shut down the engines according to protocol, and above them, Iris's footsteps were already thundering as she finally broke through the doors. An hour later, the train descended from the great viaduct onto the solid embankment of the final stretch as smoothly as stepping off thin ice. The registry announced over all the panels that there were 2 stops left until the terminal station. The panels flashed, and everyone waited for the announcement to end. But the register paused and added a phrase that had never appeared in any log throughout all 29 cycles. He said that for the first time in his existence, he liked what he was carrying. For the last 2 runs, the train traveled in a way it hadn't once in 29 cycles. The doors of all the cars remained open from the first to the last, and one could walk right through the entire train, crossing 415 thresholds without ever seeing a weapon on a belt. Because the council had printed a simple rule, and it was posted in every car. Weapons must be turned into the armory before disembarking. For the first day, people crossed the former border between the head and tail of the train as cautiously as one walks on thin ice. On the second day, Arlen saw in car number 90 a woman from the former Wayne Zone teaching a young conductor how to clean fish, while he taught her children how to tie naval service knots. No one had ordered this. It had sprung up on its own, like grass through the floorboards. The Council of Seals worked around the clock in shifts. Holt, along with 20 record keepers, completed the Great Census and displayed the results on the main panel. 30,112 people, 460 trades, 11 doctors, 3 music teachers. Holt read the list of professions aloud as if it were a poem, and his voice faltered at the mention of music. Mira was setting up the hospital for the first settlement and directing her assistants according to the golden diagrams on the plate. Gruber and Ortega, with their crews, were dismantling everything that could be hauled away into parts authorized by the registry. Mills, machines, filters, frames. The registry had authorized a surprisingly large amount, and when Holt asked directly why, it replied that the composition would no longer be needed in its former form and that tools must outlast machines. Selma was drafting a settlement map based on data that the registry had revealed in its entirety for the first time. The destination world had an ocean, 2 large rivers, a mild climate, and not a single predator larger than a wolf. The first conductor did not build the ark at random. He had been choosing this world for 200 years. The conductor's service ceased to exist in a single evening, without a single verdict. The council convened to deliberate, and Arlen proposed a formula that was debated for 3 hours and adopted unanimously. Blood is not judged. Deeds are judged, and everyone's deeds would start from scratch on the new land and be reckoned from scratch as well. 36 young people, led by Darius, joined the Union's security detail and now wore the Union's gold insignia on their sleeves instead of the service's silver. The elders handed over their staffs to the registry, one by one, approaching the 0 car, and the registry accepted each staff along with the full name of the person handing it over, and for some reason, this was important to all of them. The overseer woke up in the infirmary on the 3rd day after the viaduct. The first thing he saw was his son, who was sitting next to him on a stool, going over the contribution table for the last stop with Theo, because Holt had assigned both of them to handle the accounting. The old man watched them for a long time. Then he wept silently and motionlessly, the way very old and very proud people weep. No one in the infirmary pretended not to notice, and no one made a big deal out of it. Mira simply changed his bandage and told him dinner would be ready in an hour. Kale went to the council himself and asked for a job. The council remained silent, so he asked for a specific assignment, the engine room under Register's supervision for the rest of the journey, and any menial work afterward. Register was the first to agree, even before the others, and said that hands familiar with the engines would be useful for preserving the train. Theo took Finn under his wing as a scout, and a day later they were already having a pillow fight in the ventilation ducts. The patrol had to break it up. At the second-to-last stop, the train gathered for one last roll call, and the gathering turned into a celebration the train had never seen before. The world they found was warm and grassy, with low hills and not a single living creature within a day's journey. The registrar allowed not 3 hours but 10, because he now had the right to interpret the regulations in the passengers' favor. People gathered seeds and cuttings according to Holt's lists, dug up seedlings, and simply lay in the grass with their arms outstretched, because after a year of metal and fog, many had forgotten the scent of living earth. The children who had been born on the train touched the grass as if it were a miracle. Arlen found the first conductor on a distant hillock. Over the past few days, the old man had grown so strong that he walked on his own with a cane made of black wood from the dead city and kept touching things: the grass, bark, the train's metal, children's heads as they ran up to look at the oldest man in the world. He told Arlen without preamble that he had asked the registry to stay in this grassy world for good, and that the registry had granted his request, arguing for only a minute. The builder didn't want to see the final station. He explained this, looking not at Arlen but at the hills. The final station belongs to those who have endured it through this year, and these train cars. But he had already built his part, and what he had built had moved on without him, just as it should. He asked for only one thing: that sometimes someone would tell the children that the train was built by a man, not a god, and that the man had made mistakes. In the morning, the train departed, and on the hill remained a hut built overnight by Ortega and half the assault company, with a year's supply of food and a filter made from armchair parts. The old man stood by the hut, waving a stick at the train until its tail disappeared behind the hills, and the entire train watched him from the windows, and no one said a word. The final leg of the journey took 3 days. On the second day, Arlen did what he had been putting off until the very last moment because he feared it more than he feared Kale. He went to the 17th car, to seat 33-1. The car stood empty, spotless, and strangely solemn. A changing of the honor guard of veterans from the first contingent, one that no one had ever officially appointed, was taking place by the seat. It had formed on its own a week ago, and Holt had pretended not to know about it so he wouldn't have to put it on record. The veterans silently filed out, leaving him alone. Arlen sat down in his seat, the third row from the rear door, by the window. He placed his palm on the armrest just as he had done 1,000 times before. The metal warmed up one last time, and the warmth was the same as on the very first day, as if it were alive. A click sounded quietly, almost shyly. In the recessed compartment lay a plastic bottle of water, sealed, cold, half a liter. An exact replica of the very first one, down to the last crease on the label, which wasn't there. Arlen held it with both hands and laughed, unable to stop, and his laughter was wet. Then he noticed, at the bottom of the now empty compartment, something that hadn't been there on the first day: a thin golden line engraved directly onto the metal. The registry translated it in a voice as quiet as one would use when translating for a single person. The line stated that the source had fulfilled its purpose and was passing into memory. The chair grew cold right beneath his palm. Slowly, like a weary beast that has reached its destination, ordinary iron. Arlen sat there a little longer. Then he put the bottle back in the niche and asked the registry to leave car number 17 as it was, forever. Not to dismantle it, not even for the most essential parts. The registry replied that it had entered the car into the inviolable registry of memory yesterday, along with the inscription on the wall of Gray 15, and that it now allowed itself to make certain decisions in advance. At dawn on the third day, the mist outside the windows thinned, began to streak, and burst like a film. The train emerged from the last tunnel between the worlds onto a high arc above the Green Valley, and 30,000 people saw it at the same moment. Below lay the world. 2 rivers converged in a silver fork into a wide expanse of water. The ocean glowed beneath the low morning sun on the horizon, a smooth strip of fire. Forests stood on the hills like herds. Birds flew over the valley in a wedge formation and did not break ranks at the sound of the iron thunder because they had never heard it before. People pressed themselves against the windows along the entire length of the train, and the train moved through their shared silence as if through water. Even the children were silent. The register guided it down the arc, gently and slowly, as one would carry a sleeping child. Then came the platform, a real white platform made of bone-like stone, built 300 years ago for a single moment and having waited for it for 29 cycles. The train came to a stop without a jolt, and the announcer announced its arrival with words that had apparently lain in his memory for all 300 years, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. He said that the journey was over, that there were no more tracks ahead, and that the doors were opening for the last time. Arlen stepped out first, not because he was the ruler. The council had argued over who would step out first and voted unanimously against his will. Someone had to set the first foot on the new land, and the council decided it would be the one who was the first in the death car to begin sharing. The grass sprang up beneath his boot. The air was so inviting he wanted to eat it with a spoon. It smelled of the river, of heated stone, and of something sweet that didn't yet have a name. The convoy surged forward. Iris was directing the resettlement columns across Selma's map, and her voice carried across the entire valley. Solo burned the first clearing toward the water with blue fire, and for the first time, the fire wasn't being used for war. Holt was already standing with Selma over the tablet, and they were yelling at each other about where to build the school, both beaming. Theo rushed past with a group of his own people and former service colleagues and shouted as he ran that the river was real and the fish in it were stupid. Malat and KL worked together in silence, unloading the plows and passing them down to the same pair of hands. Mira was setting up the hospital tents in the shade of the first hill, and her first patient was a woman from car 301 who had gone into labor right on the platform. By sunset, the baby was crying loud enough for the whole camp to hear, and the registrar, on his own initiative, entered the child into the census as the first citizen without a car number. From that day on, the car number column in the census was no more. By evening, the settlement's first bonfire was burning on the hill, and the full council of seals was seated around it, along with the registrar, whose voice from a small panel that Gruber had assembled for him as a temporary body mounted on the wheels of a wheelbarrow. Arlen asked him what he would do now that the flight was over and there were no more protocols. The register was silent for a long time by his standards, a full 3 seconds. Then he said that, for the first time in his entire existence, he had no instructions, and it felt like what people call dizziness, and that he'd simply like to keep track of the new world, crops, births, rain. If the council would hire him, Holt was the first to laugh and said that the city could manage 2 record keepers somehow, as long as the second one didn't argue about handwriting. Arlen sat by the fire and looked down at the valley where people from 29 failed cycles merged into a single people over the course of a single year were walking among the tents. Former passengers, former conductors, former enemies from the car wars who, by day, hauled logs together. No one paid the fee anymore for the right to live to see the morning. No one looked at the display board. He recalled the cramped car and the steady voice demanding 20 units, and his former self, who knew only how to count and remain silent at the end of the line. The train did not choose the strongest, he realized finally and calmly, nor the smartest. All that year, the train had patiently chosen the one who, in the death car, would be the first to start sharing. Everything else was a test of the endurance of that single quality. In the morning, on the white platform, Gruber's people installed an iron plaque cast from the frame of chair 33, which Arlen had allowed them to take because memory should be put to work, not left to lie idle. The plaque was engraved with the words that the road ended here and the land began. And below was a line suggested by Theo, which the council adopted unanimously on the first vote, something that had happened only twice in the council's entire history. The line read that the city was called 17th, in honor of the train car where strangers first decided to survive together. The train remained standing by the platform as a monument to itself, as a warehouse, and as the first school until a stone one was built. Its doors never closed again, and no one ever knocked on them again. And for many years to come, in seat 33, the city's children would find a bottle of cold water left there by one of the elders, because 17th had developed a tradition older than even its oldest laws, to return to where it all began and leave something behind for those who would come after you. That was the end of the story of Arlen Voss, the storeroom attendant from Car 17. The story of Car 17 was just beginning. And many years later, when the first citizen without a car number had grown up and asked old Arlen if it was true that people once paid for water with their lives, Arlen reached for a cold bottle from the shelf by his armchair and told him it was true. And that was exactly why, in Car 17, they never sold water to anyone, ever. They left it there.